The torches threw wavering light across the marble as she moved barefoot toward the thing waiting in the corner. Her fingers trembled so hard she couldn't steady them. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood without a word, faces lit by oil lamps, eyes locked on her, as if she were already on trial. They'd told her it was tradition. Every bride had done it. To resist would stain her family with shame. But no one had ever said what it was, not until now. Not until the cloth was lifted and the secret of Roman marriage finally showed itself. It was 89 CE, in the reign of Emperor Domitian. Flavia Tertia was 18 years old, and tonight she was learning that a Roman wedding didn't end with saffron veils and scattered walnuts. What happened in the house, after the procession, with witnesses present, witnesses who could be called to testify if anything was challenged later, was something else entirely. The kind of thing Rome's own historians tiptoed around. The kind of thing the Christian church would later try to scrub clean from memory. And yeah, before we go further, I want you to pause for a second and picture this with me. A ritual from 2,000 years ago, unfolding step by step, and we're here talking about it now. If you've ever wondered how much of the past is still echoing in the present, you're already in the right place. Earlier that day, everything had looked like a wedding should, beautiful even. Flavia wore the flame-colored veil that marked her as a bride. Her hair was divided into 6 braids and bound with wool ribbons exactly as custom demanded. The sacrifice at the temple had been smooth. The sheep's entrails showed favorable signs, and the priest gave a satisfied nod. Her father signed the contract that transferred her out of his legal authority and into her husband's, reciting the ancient formula that made the union binding under Roman law. Then came the words every Roman bride spoke, the words that ended one life and began another. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia, I am Gaia. They sounded sweet enough, almost poetic. But what they meant was simple and brutal. She was no longer herself. She belonged to her husband now, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than her, a man she had met 3 times before today. The ceremony was the legal start, a signature, a public seal. The real transformation waited at the end of the torchlit walk through Rome's streets, in a house she'd never stepped into before, in a room where strangers were already gathered. As the procession moved through the city, the crowd did what crowds always did at Roman weddings. They sang the Fescennine verses, traditional songs so obscene Flavia could feel her cheeks burning beneath her veil. The lyrics weren't subtle. They shouted exactly what would happen to her that night, in graphic detail, and young men in the crowd called out helpful suggestions that made her stomach twist. Her mother had said it was meant to drive away evil spirits through laughter and embarrassment. But Flavia noticed something that morning. Her mother wasn't laughing. She cried while she braided Flavia's hair, and when it was time to leave, she leaned in close and whispered like she was passing on a warning, not a blessing. Do not resist. Whatever they require, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. By the time they reached Marcus's house, the sun had vanished. Wool garlands and greenery framed the doorway. 2 torches burned on either side, marking it as a place where the marriage would be completed under law. Outside, the crowd's chanting grew louder, cruder. Someone hurled walnuts at her, an old fertility blessing. The shells caught in the folds of her dress, and it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like being pelted. Marcus stood in the doorway waiting. Behind him, Flavia saw figures moving in lamplight. Too many figures. far too many for what was supposed to be a private moment between husband and wife. He lifted her over the threshold. That was tradition too. They said it was to prevent bad luck if a bride stumbled entering her new home. But the gesture came from something older and much darker, an era when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wanted to enter or not. The door shut behind her, cutting off the street noise like a blade. Inside the atrium, the lamplight revealed exactly who had been waiting. An elderly woman in formal robes stepped forward, the Pranuba. Her job was to oversee everything about to happen. Near her stood a priest. Flavia couldn't even tell which cult he belonged to. 3 female slaves held basins and cloths. An older man lingered back with a leather satchel at his feet, the kind physicians used for instruments. And in the corner, half hidden beneath draped fabric, stood a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The Pranuba took Flavia's hands in a grip that was firm enough to feel like restraint. "Welcome to your husband's home," she said. Her voice was calm, official, the way people speak when they believe they're doing something sacred. The sacred rites must now be completed. And here's the part most people never hear about Roman marriage. It wasn't primarily about romance. It wasn't even primarily about partnership. It was a property transfer, documented, witnessed, protected under law the same way you'd transfer land, livestock, or a ship. Romans called marriage conventio in manum, coming into the hand. A woman passed from her father's authority into her husband's. In earlier centuries, that transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal power over his wife as he had over his slaves, including, at least in theory, the right of life and death. By Flavia's time, the imperial period, the edges had softened. Women could own property. Divorce was possible, at least for the wealthy, but the principle didn't change. Marriage moved a woman from one man's control to another's, and like any major property exchange in Rome, it needed verification. Think about how Romans sold land, witnesses observed. The property was inspected to make sure it matched the seller's claim. Rituals called down divine favor. Boundaries were walked, documents sealed, and everyone understood exactly what was being traded. They applied that same logic to marriage, with one crucial addition. A bride's value wasn't just her dowry. It was her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was part of the transfer. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. And Roman law demanded both be proven before the transaction could be considered complete. This isn't modern interpretation. Roman legal texts say it outright. A marriage was not valid until consummated, and consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses. Because without witnesses, how could anyone prove it happened? On top of that, virginity had to be verified, because without proof of virginity, how could a husband be certain any child she bore was his? Every requirement produced a ritual. Every ritual fit Roman legal logic. And every ritual feels horrifying to us now because that logic is so alien to everything we think marriage should be. The Pranuba guided Flavia toward the draped structure in the corner. Her hand stayed on Flavia's arm, not gently, but like a gate closing behind her. Flavia's heart hammered in her chest so loudly, she thought the entire room could hear it. "You must greet Mutinous Tutinous," the Pranuba said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia swallowed hard. Her hands were numb where she reached for the cloth. She pulled it back. Beneath it stood a wooden figure carved with almost clinical precision into the shape of a phallus. Not a small charm like the ones Roman children wore for protection. Not a crude household idol. This thing was life-sized. deliberately proportioned for a purpose Flavia suddenly understood, without anyone having to say the words. Mutinus Tutinus was an old Roman god of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because multiple ancient writers mention him, almost always briefly, almost always with visible discomfort. Centuries later, when Christianity was swallowing the old pagan world, St. Augustine described the practice in disgust. Roman brides were required to sit upon Mutinus's wooden emblem as a sacred duty before they could be approached by their husbands. Augustine hated paganism, yes, but he wasn't alone. Lactantius called the ritual so shameful that even naming it polluted the speaker. Arnobius went further, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem while their husbands watched. And Varro, a respected antiquarian writing long before Christianity had an agenda, mentioned mutinus tutinus in language that clearly implied physical contact, even if he didn't spell out the mechanics. Modern historians sometimes try to soften this, suggesting it was symbolic, just a quick seated gesture, nothing more. But that doesn't fit the ancient wording. Augustine used incidere, a verb that means to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing points toward penetration. Lactantius's refusal to describe details makes no sense if the act was harmless. The stated purpose was divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose